Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
It's episode 57 of Quarantine. We're edging it on 1 year, and what a strange trip it's been. In previous episodes, you may remember a virus overtook America. The country reacted, building new forms of communications and connectivity, figuring out how to deal with grief, and then going through a great summer of unrest and populism. In fact, populist mobs have been a popular theme lately. They've been storming the Capitol, making themselves known, changing the elections, and just when you figured they had to take a week off because there was a new and somewhat boring president, they found a new cause. Because this is the week that the populists stormed Wall Street, took on the hedge funds, and put in front of all of us short selling as kind of an alternative reality game played on Robinhood and egged on by Reddit. Hey, Mick, it's so exciting that it's always exciting around here. Welcome.
Hey, Peter. I have no idea what is going on. I sort of disconnected, decided I wasn't going to track anything on social media this week, and then, you know, I'm lost. So I'm just happy to be here, and I'll just be the face of a country has no idea who's going on. So I might ask some dumb questions. Take it away.
Yeah. So this is by the way, one of the fun things about this week is so much new went on that required frame of reference. Obviously, today's show is going to be on this whole bit about the stock called GameStop being bid up to 300, even though it had been hanging out, around 3 for a long time, because it got in trouble with short sellers that were trying to drive it down, and then an entire mob of populist people on Robinhood, which is a consumer app, said, "Hey, if the hedge funds play this game, we'll play opposite them," and they've been duking it out all week, and this has forced us to start rethinking kind of the nature of who wins on Wall Street, what's fair and what's not fair. If a whole bunch of retail investors do something that looks like an irrational bet, is that actually a really powerful example of financial liberation? And then I kept trying to think through the difference between investing because there's fundamental value there and sentiment. This term has evolved this week called a meme stock. A meme stock means you're interested in it not because it's particularly valuable, but because everybody else says so, and it has a story behind it, which to me sounds like a wonderful 2021 term for a bubble, but it is a new day.
Yeah, well, you're reminding me. I mean, obviously, social norms, social pressure, social proof. That gets amplified, and we've had a lot of things happening with algorithms of oppression. Sophia Noble's told us a little bit about this, and how we're sort of hacking the brain in some ways. And it's not surprising that maybe something called a meme stock would be a bubble. I remember when I was first researching information ecologies, I learned about the tulip bubble in the 1600s, where people were speculating on tulips, and they were like, people on the street would be bumping into each other and saying, have you bought this tulip stock? Because they were trying to make a perfect black tulip, and it turns out it was a parasite that made it. It was very fragile. And then Isaac Newton got pulled in from being a physicist to actually recoin the Bank of England, because basically there was a real problem with liquidity. So when you get the smartest person on the planet at the time to suddenly take over the Bank of England and try to bring back some rationality, what's our plan this time?
And okay, so this time, let's introduce who's going to be on here and how we're going to look at this. So first of all, so much of this has unfolded on Reddit, where in fact Wall Street Bets was the meme home. So on our show today is Melissa Tidwell. Welcome, Melissa. Melissa,
hi guys.
You are the former general counsel of Reddit, and you were there watching what happens when people show up and cannot be managed, much less moderated. You've lived through kind of the growth of Reddit and what this beast is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, thank you for having me. This is a fun new experience for me. I joined Reddit from Google back in 2015. And I actually ended up, by the time I left in 2019, ended up owning legal policy, which is both product policy and public policy, communications, and then a portion of operations, right? So
wow.
I think what is new for most people who are new to Reddit is the power of sort of the group, persona, right? And some of that action. You've heard a lot about it, I think, in the context of disinformation campaigns and whatnot. Again, on Reddit, very different construct because Reddit's organized around interest, right? So Wall Street Bets is been around for a while, and it's a community where they're always talking about stocks, right? The GameStop has been talked about on Wall Street Bets for, I think, almost over a year. Where people were concerned about, like, sort of, is it, is what the hedge funds are doing, does that make sense? Even if you look at the financials.
And we're going to go in depth on this. I want to just show everyone how we're going to go through today. So we're going to set up the background here. Then we're going to be joined by Richard Titus. And Richard is a good friend and has been an investor. And
let's bring Richard on just to say hi.
Richard, hello. Yes, hello.
Hi.
Richard was a founder of Razorfish, and you wrote a very interesting piece yesterday in which you talked about it's not so good to storm the Capitol, the one that they stormed last week, but taking capital for the public. Really interesting idea. So you can help us understand what's going on from multiple perspectives.
Great. Hey, thanks for having me, Peter and Mike, Mickey. It's fantastic to be here.
Good to see
I was intrigued. I'm always fascinated by revolution. One of my favorite movies is a documentary called How to Start a Revolution. It talks about some of the sentient work around revolutionary thought and action. And so I looked at this sort of, the assault on capital and the assault on the capital.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of the similar populism there, right? There's a lot of distrust, a failure of sort of systems of regulation and communication. And people are fed up and sort of want to take things into their own hands. And I think that's how we ended up with Trump, and I think that's how we got rid of him. And the thing I raised in my blog and talked about is I'm really concerned as a society we aren't getting to the underlying issues. We're focusing all of our energy on sort of topical treatments, ointments and creams for what we see on the surface. Stopping trading of this one stock on Robinhood, which is, by the way, not the only platform they're trading on. It's just the largest aggregator with the smallest capital base, which is why you keep reading about it in the news.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is going to be fun. And then who else do we have, Peter?
And then Dave Troy's coming back. Dave was with us a couple weeks ago. We did our show on deplatforming and disinformation. Okay, here we have a network phenomenon at scale. And is it, as it appears, simply a fight between hedge fund people and the rest of us? Or are there other forces at work, foreign forces, the other bots that have been messing with us for a while?
Yeah, well, so that was the narrative that took hold in the last couple of days, was that it was the little guy versus the hedge fund guys. And that's a very easy story to kind of understand and for people to latch onto. And what we noticed in the disinformation community was that all of the nodes that light up around, pushing disinformation around, say from Russia and QAnon and that kind of thing, were all super into this. And likewise, a lot of people on the progressive left were very into this. And, we were basically trying to evaluate, A, what's really true, what's actually happening, and why are these propaganda channels, people like Steve Bannon and people involved in QAnon, why are they suddenly so interested in pushing this? So we tried to get to the bottom of at least a little bit of understanding of why that might light up those nodes in the network, and then try to kind of reverse engineer from there what might be something, things we could expect as a result of that engagement.
This is so great. In this era, this kind of analysis is so important. And then, Mick, as our final guest today, who will take us into the future in terms of what this all might mean?
So I'd love to have Hanu come on. Hanu, come on. So I'm a huge fan of Hanu's work. He, when I first got to know him, because he had this amazing book called The Quantum Thief. And I was like, oh my gosh, wait, what if we did have quantum thieves like Robinhood, but in the future? And you have a synthetic biology company. I'm like, what if this was not happening on Reddit with bits, but what if this was happening with like biology? What if something? So I don't even know where we go with this, but Hanu, what's your passion right now? Just a sentence or two to give everyone else a sense of where you're coming from, because this is just part of your sort of having fun, but you're doing some amazing other things.
Yeah, so besides writing books, I'm the CEO of Helix Nano, which is a synthetic biology company, pre-pandemic, doing work in oncology. But during our COVID times, we've been working on essentially a next generation COVID mRNA vaccine that should be more resistant against mutated strains. And so I've been very interested, besides sort of the core business of the company, generally where things are going with synthetic biology, because the tools of biology, just like tools of finance and investing, are increasingly being democratized. And now power that has been traditionally locked up in biopharmaceutical companies is kind of starting to be available to small community labs or individual biohackers. So it's kind of interesting to see where that goes.
Well, and Hanu, you one of the things you said to me when you were explaining Helix Nano was that if we're entering the biological century, if that might be the only way to get out of extractive economies, harvesting old dead dinosaurs for our oil and actually thinking about how nature does stuff, if it's the biological economy, we're probably not going to get it right with these new mRNA and different kinds of vaccines and stuff. There might be second order effects. There might be problems with new mutations. And we need to come up with a way to actually teach our immune system, like booster courses, like send them off to Coursera and let the immune system figure this stuff out. Because even though we're going to have some amazing successes, Moderna and others, sequencing and actually having their first candidate within a month or something, and you're probably working on some amazing things too. Just this notion that we should be more humble about about how rich and crazy complex nature is, and we're probably going to have a lot of second order effects that we should start to actually take seriously, like rabies vaccine for after you've been bitten by rabies, things like that. Can you say a sentence or two about that, just to elaborate?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think there's vaccines are sort of an interesting example of a biomedical intervention where we, as you say, actually teach the body how to deal with the problem. So unlike cancer drugs, we're not actually directly targeting the pathogen itself here, but we're teaching the immune system how to generate an immune response against it. And now I think the next challenge that we are going to face is that as we try to, again, in very reactive mode, respond to the evolution of the virus, where we are going to have to do some re-education in all likelihood. And the problem there is that we are then going to have to fight an uphill battle against the immune memory from the previous vaccination. So one of our worries at Helix Nano is, are we going to end up in the same situation with COVID as with flu vaccines, where seasonal flu vaccines really are not very effective, especially in the elderly population who we really need to protect. Given the much higher mortality of COVID, that like endemic COVID with similar levels of mortality that it has now would be pretty dystopian. So I think we do need to think carefully about how we design the booster shots and the next generation vaccines, and it might require sort of a different shift in mindset as well.
So we're probably not going to go too deep into the synthetic biology today, but when we get to sort of the section about kind of what you might see happening in the future, I'd love to do that. But right now, let's go back to, I don't know if Peter's alive or still connected or not. But let's actually think about, could we understand what's happening now, and could we build a vaccine for this weird populist thing that's happening?
And let's start with Melissa. I'd love to bring Melissa. Let's go back to Reddit, which has established itself as an incredibly powerful community generator, whether it was the Trump community that somehow had to be moderated or the Wall Street community. Walk us back to what it was like being on the inside and what started dawning on people when they realized what had been wrought, and what were the conflicts that came up?
I mean, look, I think one of the challenges, Reddit's one of the original, sort of internet companies, right? We, Alexis and Steve Huffman founded the company, I believe back in probably 2005. They were the first Y Combinator class. And, Condé Nast originally had bought the company, and then it was spun out. in 2014. And I think what happened was, with the rise of sort of Facebook and YouTube and, Pinterest and Twitter and, all of those companies, Reddit has always just had a really steady sort of growth model. It's pseudonymous, which is user-based. There's a whole sort of calculation of like, you have a user persona, you upvote things, you downvote things, you get, you have a, sort of a score essentially based on your activity on the site, which has always created sort of different challenges as to sort of from a management perspective. So when I joined in 2015, we were extraordinarily small, probably 50, 55 people. And we had, a user base of over 100 million monthly actives. And a lot of what we did, starting with Ellen, who hired me through when Steve Huffman came back as CEO, was to just kind of like slowly rebuild the site. Like, I think given the size of the platform, we always had the persona, the thinking of slow and steady wins the race, and slowly make improvements over time to start to address some of the issues that we were starting to see, right? But I think as a cultural sort of team, what we are very used to is sort of the team dynamic of the interested groups on Reddit, even sort of coming dealing with the admins, as they call us, with the internal company. So we changed a lot of our strategies early on. Steve, as an example, we talk with the community much more often than a lot of companies do. I think getting to some of the points that that some folks will raise about sort of frustrations, we've really tried to foster a relationship with the communities and to ensure that they can grow.
What this reminds me of is your community was much more a community than customers. I mean, at AOL, they were customers.
For sure.
You told me a lot more like Burning Man. Once Burning Man gets created, if the cats don't like what the founders of Burning Man are doing, they're just going to keep nudging and pushing, and they're going to have to adapt. Yeah,
for sure. And you see this across the board, right? Even if you look at the political spectrum on Reddit, there is anarchists. There was a Donald Trump community that got out of hand. There was, there was a Bernie Sanders community. There was a Hillary Clinton community. There was an Andrew Yang. The Yang Gang was very large on Reddit, right? It's a great place to sort of collect a group of people to have a conversation if you are interested in a topic, right? And I think as a result, certainly has its own sets of challenges, but you just create a completely different dynamic than what is like the Twitter funnel as an example of communication.
Well, can you explain a little more? Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
I was just going to ask a little bit about this phenomenon of getting out of hand, right? So we've obviously seen a lot this year, when you read the Roger McNamee's book and stuff, where memes can go flying off and become extremist. You had a Trump group that got out of hand. At some point, these Wall Street conversations go from conversations to giant market moving things. The president's looking at it, everybody's looking at it. What's your view on that? And of course, so much of the conversation is the business model of Silicon Valley reinforce getting out of hand, reinforce extremism.
I think Reddit, I certainly don't, I've been gone from the company for quite a while, so I can't really sort of chat through kind of where they are today, but I would say a couple of things. Reddit as a platform is just fundamentally different in sort of what the issues are. And I think part of that is because it's such a dispersed group, right? Like if you look back, we did a post as an example on disinformation, on sort of the Russian disinformation campaign and what happened. And unlike a lot of platforms, Reddit is very open. We have an open API that you can search. We posted sort of exactly what we found, and sort of the attempts to sort of deal with Reddit were actually slim to none because Reddit is hard to use fundamentally because of the community structure, right? Yeah. You can't just pop in and say like, ooh, let's look over here. If you're in power washing porn, the rules of power washing porn are different than the rules of,
Well, I want to ask what power washing porn is. It seems like it's probably washing your house. Is that right?
Well, anything that you would like to clean with the power washer, Mick.
It
is. If you are a clean person and you like seeing the power wash and seeing the dirt come away, this is the place for you.
But actually, I think for the viewers here who maybe don't really even know what Reddit is, because I'll be I'm the proxy for the audience. Can you say a little bit more about like upvoting and downvoting and stuff? Because I actually think that's one of the reasons that it is different, and it is a little bit more maybe like Burning Man than say these other networks. Can you talk about the, internet's front page, the newspaper, and
So
and even AMA, I just remember that was amazing. And we'd have like the president would do an AMA, Michelle Obama would do an AMA. I'm talking about Obama, but other, other people, and it was actually kind of this beautiful feeling of being able to have a conversation with people that actually cared and thought about it. Can you give people who don't power washing? Thank you, Omid.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Omid, for putting it up. No, I mean, Reddit is a community of communities, right? And so as he was showing on power washing porn, it is people who are interested in power. I mean, I bought a power washer after joining power washing porn. And I think it's a place, again, it's very community based. And so there's the Reddit layer of sort of what are the Reddit rules and sort of how do we create things. And then there is the community layer that each community has their own sets of rules, right? So as an example, there is a cat community that the only thing you can talk about is cats.
And they'll police themselves. Is this true?
They police themselves. Yeah. Each community has their own set of volunteer moderators that they set the rules for that community. So we have, from an organizational perspective, we do have the traditional trust and safety teams that deal with the Reddit layer. And then we also have a community moderation team who works with the moderators of all the different communities, right? And so
what are we looking at now, Omid? What's going on?
Yeah. Oh, this is just the front page.
Okay.
Yeah, you're looking at
can you say something about moderator incentives? Are moderators volunteers?
Totally volunteer.
Yeah.
They're not, they're not Reddit employees. We've worked a lot with them. We have moderator roadshows every year. We get to sort of, talk to them and listen to them and sort of hear their concerns. A lot of what we work on with them is what tools do we need to build to help them do their job better, separate from us doing it, right? And so where are they having frustrations? We do.
I'd like to pay attention to you, Melissa, but at this point,
It's very distracting.
I have low cognitive capacity.
Yeah. So that community structure is very different. And I think, Vic, to your question, you can upvote things, and unlike a lot of platforms, you can actually downvote things. So that adds, and that balance sort of then, there's an algorithm that sort of then uses that to get into like where you are. As an example, Omid was not logged in. He can see that, but he can't vote or downvote as a non-registered user. He also can't comment, right? So only when you create an account can you sort of do those types of activities and sort of join communities.
This community, the Wall Street Bets community, which had been discussing Wall Street strategies and retail strategies for some time, at some point, one of the members of the community started recognizing that GameStop was undervalued. And then there was this community aggregation or swarm effect where it's like, let's all do this at once, right? So it's a little different than kind of normal sentiment or a bubble. People were trying to be coherent. And if you followed it for the last few days, as they were trying to ride it up to hurt the short sellers even more, the whole commentary was, let's do this, nobody sell. I mean, it reminded me of something between the Bitcoin community where everybody's, you better be a holder, and a religious revival thing, like you better believe. Is there some point that you realized within Reddit that, like, some of these things just like they took off and became more a spiritual thing than just a conversation? I mean, there's a lot of energy in this.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's a ton of energy that these things take on. And I think there's a lot of users who really believe in kind of that populism, sort of mentality, right? I think that's really core to what, in many ways, to sort of Reddit's, to sort of what Reddit is, right? And I think, there have been obviously negative sides to that. And there are the positive sides to it. And I think what's really interesting about sort of what's going on is it's very Reddit-y to have, users essentially who are saying, I think, look, Wall Street, we don't really care. Yes, you're trying to short and make $1, but Reddit's also a big gaming community. But like as gamers, we don't want them
like
to
a game.
Yeah, we don't want them to go.
Hey, Melissa.
Yeah,
Martin Luther
the
did
actual
this.
GameStop. Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin Luther did this to the church when printing press was invented. So why not Reddit to do it to other institutions now? I want to bring in a moment Richard Titus in, But as a transition, I want to show a clip yesterday as all of this was taking off, and then in the middle of all this, the platform a lot of people were trading, Robinhood, which as a platform was very popular for retail investors. It was because it was free to trade. Instead of paying for a trade, they simply sold trading information to someone. And we can talk about how well that ends up. In any event, Robinhood yesterday put the brakes on all of this, which then made it look like that the consumer-friendly trading platform was betting against the consumer, which then led to outrage on the right and on the left. And then last night, AOC held a meeting on Twitch. So AOC was on Twitch with Redditors discussing what Reddit was doing to the U.S. economy. So I want to show a clip of AOC last night, and then Richard will join us, and we're going to talk about this week's revolution.
This week, one of the reasons that there was this huge, almost populist bottom-up type of rally on what was going on was that it felt like almost the first time that anybody was holding these folks who game this system accountable or have any sort of answer in that way.
For me personally, I think it's a twofold issue. One, you have the old idea that is you won't get in trouble if you rob from the poor, only if you do from the rich. Okay. And so that's kind of what we saw during the 2008 crisis, right? If you look into the politics of it, the only person who went to prison, I won't say his name, but he got caught and went to prison. He stole from rich people. But the banks and all of those corporations who robbed the American people, they got bailed out. Sure, somebody got fired with a $50 million golden parachute package. All right. Hey, if you have a small bank account, if you have under $25,000, we're not going to let you day trade because we at the government know that we've got to protect you. Kind of what we heard from some of the brokerages today. We're gonna stop your ability to trade to mitigate the risk because we want to protect you. Excuse me, government, you're telling me my $4,000 I can't day trade, but I can still go to the casino and put it all on red, right? Yeah, that's cool. But wait, but I can't do it 4,000. Well, what about the guy who has 5 million? Oh wait, what about the guy who has 5 million of someone else's money who's betting that on? That's cool though, right?
Or shorting a stock for 130%.
Exactly. These politicians, who are their biggest donors? Hedge funds, banks, billionaires. Who stands to gain the most or lose the most from this? Who writes the laws? So now as a retail trader, I have to look and say, do I really think that my congressman and my senator who are funded by these people are going to write laws to protect me and hurt them?
Yep.
No, they're going to wait for the next news cycle story to happen, and then all of it's going to disappear.
We should just call this show Populism Today.
I mean,
hey, Richard Titus. We'll bring you in. There you are. Are you in? Yes. Oh my God, you're in. There we go. Excellent. We took off that little. By the way, that little bug. Can you put that bug up a little bit for a second, Omid? We have the stay home, save lives, which usually just has that little message. Last week we stuck in Bernie with his meme, and this week we have the money god. Because Chinese New Year is coming up. And so we just figured the money god ought to show up here because that's what we're talking about. Okay, Richard, you've been an investor. You've been involved in blockchain, its own religion. And yesterday you were really looking at this as a cascading set of kind of revolutions. Tell us a little bit about what you were thinking yesterday and how do we frame the various competing significant forces going on here? I think we have to unmute somebody. Richard, we have to unmute Richard.
Unmute Richard. Yeah, there you go.
Dictionary. And I've lived through some really interesting things in my life. I've been in some conflict zones and been through that a few times. But I also always sort of cheer for the underdog, even as I really don't qualify as an underdog anymore, as you can see by everything around me. I still love the underdog, and I love that spirit. And I have been really my experiences with the traditional finance world, but even with my company Razorfish, and I was one of the founders of Razorfish. There are 11 to 13 of us, depending on how you count. But going through the roadshow and the IPO was a life-changing experience for me in many, many ways. And watching the way the markets worked and the system worked, there were all these little moments where you're like, wait a minute, that's not fair. that's not right. Like, and later on, I collared some of my stock for tax risk, and collaring or straddling, as it's called. Like, I literally remember saying to my then wife, "This feels like it really shouldn't be legal." Like I'm doing things that don't make any sense. Like, how can I do this? I'm basically taking all my risk away for not very much money. And so what happened this week was fascinating. Is the market was working, right? So the market, a bunch of people borrowed a bunch of money and a bunch of shares. Some of those shares borrowed, I think, without people knowing they were loaning them, which is there's a little bit of irony here. Is some of the shares owned by the people who bought this to force the short squeeze were actually being borrowed to short, right? So there was this moment in time where the investor community on Wall Street Bets saw that there was a vulnerability, and they took advantage of it, just like Wall Street does all the time. We've seen this with Tesla 2 years ago and again last year. And Elon hates short sellers because he sees this kind of frenetic activity, and there is a lot of sort of media campaigning, and you'll see like people start writing articles questioning the fundamentals of a business, and then suddenly you look and a bunch of these people are short on the deal. And so what Wall Street Bets community said is, they said, look, they're short 137%, I think it was on Sunday afternoon, and they said buy. And there was some interesting, if you know about the game business, I started my career in video games. I don't think Peter even knows that. I made some video games, one that was held up by Tipper Gore on the floor of the Senate as an abomination to children, which I view as a personal achievement in my life.
What a glorious halcyon era back then. What was the name of the game, by the way?
Game until she did that, right? It was like winning. But the point of it is that the games business is one that many Gen Xers and Gen Y really, really love the games business. We love GameStop. It's a brand that's really I in my blog I put a little bit of a blurb in there about what I would do if I was CEO. Now, what's interesting is I did a little digging since then, and the new management team is doing many of the things I suggested. Like, they're turning it into an e-games brand. They're thinking about how to build community and make it more like an Apple store, where my girlfriend works at Apple and works in that world, and less of a sort of retail ching sell things over and over and over. So I actually think the brand.
I would have done this with Radio Shack if I could have gotten them somehow to not die. And I was trying so hard to convince Dale Doherty at Make Magazine, like,
now,
can we take over all of the Radio Shacks? Because people like making things, But
I wish there was Radio Shack now for making your own Wi-Fi transceivers. But what's interesting about this is somewhere there's a value that's greater than the value that was trading last week for GameStop, and the value it's currently trading at now, even despite all of the chaos in the markets. Because at this point, this is not about money anymore. It's about revolution. And, so I did actually participate briefly in this. I bought some shares, and I actually made a not a significant amount of money. And then I sold them so I could write the blog, because I realized I couldn't write that blog without selling those shares, because I would be breaching securities law. And I for sure have a big target on my back. So that was kind of an interesting moment, is I had to sell the shares so I could talk about the larger phenomena with no risk. Yeah. And that in itself kind of tells you that we really have to rethink all of these rules in the information economy, where information knowledge transits like this, and it's very hard to sort of define what's public and private information, and what is sort of advantage and disadvantage, and how do we score that, right? But I do think that even what we heard from AOC and the person who was talking with her, Mariana Mazzucato has she's a rogue economist who's written a book called The Value of Everything. And she's gone and looked at why the last 30 or 40 years have had this massive bifurcation, where being in finance made money for being in finance, not necessarily for providing any value. And I think we've started to see that over 40 years. And we don't treat like the taxpayers as the first investors on IP, even though you can see everything in an iPhone actually came from, taxpayer funded research. And so this notion that we haven't really understood what the value, we don't even talk about value theory anymore. I guess Adam Smith figured it out, and we teach like 101, it's whatever the market will bear, which means the people with finance have incredibly great houses, I guess, in New York City, because they must be valuable.
But
And I don't
the
wanna-
idea that you're valuable for being valuable.
Well, I don't want to nerd out here on valuation
Yeah.
theory, but there's an interesting thing. Full disclosure, I'm an investor in Tesla. I invested before the IPO. My ex-wife and I made a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car, and so I had access to the
Oh, I
business.
remember this. Oh my gosh, with Ed Begley.
I got really,
yeah.
So I got really excited.
Yeah.
So I bought some shares before the IPO, and we held some of them. We sold some of the divorce, and I kept some of them. And if you remember, there was a short squeeze last year, and I sold some of my shares at the top of that short squeeze because I was like, this valuation's crazy. And the minute it dropped back down, I bought again, more actually. And people were like, yeah. And my brother is a trader, by the way. My brother, and he's like, you're crazy. It's not a car company. I said, Tesla's not a car company. It's a tracking stock for Elon Musk. And as a tracking stock for Elon Musk, it's undervalued. As a car company, yeah, it's probably a little overvalued, but we don't really understand what car companies and what data companies are today. And so I would argue GameStop, GameStop might have been undervalued last week. It's for sure not undervalued now.
Yeah, but I think that the brand.
Yeah, actually, wait, Melissa, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think what you're hitting on is the brand perception piece, right? I think what financial models don't account for is a brand affinity and sort of the belief of people in brands. And you see this all the time, right? And I think in tech, what's interesting is that tech, the brand affinity sort of carries the stock. And that's why you have higher, higher stock prices and whatnot. It's just unacceptable to a certain extent and other areas. And I think what you're seeing, or what started at least with GameStop, is that brand affinity to say, like, actually, no, we don't really want it to go away.
And then I think you are seeing a revolutionary theme, right? Which is a bunch of these guys on Wall Street bets. And look, I like Chamath. I really did go on there and spend a bunch of time on there. And I felt a little dirty afterwards. They're not my peeps. But there was some good fundamental analysis, but I also really believed in what they were saying, which is like all of this short stuff, the very fact that you can buy or sell or hypothecate more shares than exist is a flaw in the system that should be for sure exploited and therefore shut down. And if you allow the market to function properly, that would, if we hadn't stopped trading, if we let a hedge fund go bankrupt, if we sort of let this spin out a little bit, for sure the SEC and some regulators would step in and say, listen, you can't borrow or short a hypothecate more than 80% of like someone has to get this in line because this is just craziness. Like this is somebody lobbied to get these rules set in sort of very arbitrary. I had a mathematician explain to me once why that was possible. And I said, yeah, but all things go to zero eventually. And so I don't buy it. Like at some point, this will come undone. Just like the financial crisis.
I mean, you're reminding me of a guest we need to have on, but we haven't as a dead guest. Abraham Lincoln said, if you want to, there's an idea around like bad laws. And if you want to get a bad law repealed, enforce it vigorously, because then you'll actually see what really the outcome is. You would hope you wouldn't have to do that, but complex systems are not obvious in how they work and the second order effects. And I think we're seeing this multiple second order effects on this as well.
I also think just like the election support, and I'm not going to make this too political, but we saw an election, whatever side you're on, you weren't really happy with the outcome, right? Like whatever side you're on, you saw things in the process of our free and fair elections that made you uncomfortable. And I think my blog was not about saying which side I'm on. It's pretty obvious if you check my Twitter feed, but it was more to say, hey, if we have problems here, we have problems in our financial markets. We have problems in the incentives and the ways we manage the ways of interoperating together. Let's come together and fix those things, not slap Band-Aids and plasters at the edges of the situation and pretend like we didn't happen. And that was really
something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say, I think, Richard, to what you're saying, I think part of the interesting challenge now is that Robinhood has really stepped in it by inserting themselves in the middle of the interaction, right? And now it's going to be about sort of why did they make the decision? The focus is going to be on sort of, they made the decision, didn't communicate it. The blog post was probably less than satisfactory, which has caused a whole other cycle of rage. Adding to it, right? And I think what you're going to end up seeing is a lot of focus on Robinhood, especially given sort of past SEC issues, and less focus on actually solving the fundamental problems that sort of created it in the first place.
Yeah. I want to go back to you in a moment. So we've been looking at, Richard, you made the point that Tesla's a tracking stock for Elon. It's not a car stock. And then Melissa points out this is brand the brand premium. And to me, this is something different than a brand premium. And I think you've hinted on this. Kind of a brand is a promise. Levi's is a promise for a certain quality thing, Apple's quality. But this is much more of a movement or a revolution or a sticking it to the man. It feels much more like, a movement or a belief system, right? And I think you can also argue that's a lot of the stuff that's been going around the various crypto mechanisms. And for me, I was probably deeply damaged. I've never really shared this, but I was deeply damaged in my youth, conceptually, mentally, because I went to Wharton, I went to business school, and they taught me the efficient market thesis, and I believe that shit. And then all the things are going on, and it's like, finally this week I'm beginning to realize maybe not, because and then last night we had Dogecoin. That was a coin that went from nothing to a whole lot because people were annoyed because they couldn't trust the system. We're losing trust in institutions so much that, so could you help explain that part, Mr. Titus?
So this is the thing, right? And this is what really worries me about our society right now, right? And we'll start with the election because it's a really easy thing. You have one side politically who believes that the election was stolen, that there was endemic cheating, and that cheating added up to be material to the outcome of the election, and one party versus another party winning. We have another party who believes that there was cheating, but it wasn't enough to turn over the election, and that therefore, they want to celebrate their massive victory, which wasn't really that massive, if we're honest. And so you really have, I would say, 100% of the electorate who doesn't really trust the system of voting for a president as being efficient and trustworthy. And that's a big problem, right? It doesn't matter who you voted for in the election. I don't think any of us trust that system with the blind trust that we did when I got the right to vote when I turned 18, right? And I was like, woohoo, I'm going to get my guy in, and I didn't get him in. So the second thing is the financial systems. And this is the part that I think there's two things happening around the financial systems and what happened this week that I think are fascinating. The first one is this idea of, and I'm going to touch on the youth versus old, because I think it's a really important metric. So I have a couple of trader friends who saw my blog and got really upset and called me and gave me an earful last night. And one of them's from the UK. He's like, I don't want to have to go on Reddit. And I said, dude, then you're going to lose a lot of money in the next 10 years. So you should stop trading. And he said, and I said, no, man, listen, if you are under 35, Reddit's where you start getting your research. And then you go to primary. Yeah. It's just like when I was running the digital parts of the Daily Mail, and the publisher said to me, can we make the website not work on phones until we sold all the newspapers in the newsstands? That's a true story, by the way. And he wasn't wrong in the sense of we made a lot of money off that advertising. But the problem is he was thinking about the problem completely wrong, right? And so I think this was a wake-up call this week to a lot of traders who've been very cozy in their sort of short activity and the inability of anyone to defend themselves. I mean, Elon Musk is a very wealthy man, but he got short squeezed a year ago, and it almost killed the company. Like, people forget. My father-in-law canceled his order of his Tesla because he thought the company was going out of business.
Melissa,
and
I know you have
me being an investor and telling him there's no chance, he was like convinced,
Melissa, you have to leave fairly soon. We just love having you. Any last words? Any thoughts?
Thank you. I mean, look, I think, Richard, you're totally right on sort of the dynamic. To make you laugh, I think I got about 5 or 6 sort of banker requests to explain sort of what is Reddit? How does it work? Who's behind it? Who are these people? Who are these people who are coordinating?
And they go on Google, they find Elizabeth Powell, and they go down this wormhole that's not expected.
So I think there's the distinction between sort of that sort of tech savvy, nerdy in the weeds to sort of folks that just aren't used to it, right? I think the other challenge and sort of now I think where I'm starting to be is I do have a fear that it's gone too far, and that who's going to be left holding the bag are, there's the informed people who start off on Wall Street bets who are actually looking at it, thinking about it. The people like Chamath that can get in and get out, right? But that's not everyone, right? And so if you're not informed, you're kind of jumping onto the meme. Yeah. Like ultimately this is gambling, and people stand to lose a lot of money because you can't keep the price up that high. So I do have a fear that while this was, I think, a really interesting example to kind of, push on Wall Street, you know, ultimately who's going to be left holding the bag is smaller, sort of the little man consumer who's been doing this trading, because hedge funds can afford to lose, you know, millions and billions of dollars. The average person cannot.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to respond to that, there's two really interesting things going on. First of all, it wasn't all young, small investors making lots of money on this. Like Blackstone made billions this week on this transaction because they happened to be on the other side of it from where the other hedge fund was.
But
and the other thing is
the informed versus the uninformed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting is I think Robinhood's being disingenuous, but I don't think they're being disingenuous in the way people think. I think they're being disingenuous because their market maker, Citadel, and Dodd-Frank, which is a set of regulatory frameworks around trading organizations, are two of the biggest reasons they had to behave the way they did. And I actually think their capitalization was a bigger problem
100%.
than Citadel's pressure. And I think this is the thing that people, you know, you're trading on Robinhood, that's not Schwab or JP Morgan. Like Schwab's not even a primary. Like, so you are on a tertiary of a tertiary, and you are at high risk. And I think, again, this all comes back to risk. People don't understand the risk they're taking, including the hedge fundies who shorted the stock.
Totally.
We think that all trading platforms, like
Melissa,
the FAA,
real quick, let's make sure Melissa gets a chance to leave, Peter.
Right.
Melissa,
Sorry,
thanks for joining us.
So much. I so enjoyed it. I wish I could stay.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks,
Have a good
Melissa,
weekend.
and we'll talk very soon. We're supposed to go for a hike soon, so I will call you. But Richard, you make an interesting point. We see Robinhood as a wonderful startup. We don't realize that it's not like both American and United have jets from Boeing and the FAA approved them or not. It's kind of like one was a student project jet and the other like actual engineering. But we didn't realize that till they had too much volume.
That's exactly right. The other thing is, remember, United and American, one of them is bankrupt and one's not, right? And a lot of people who are flying on those two airlines over and over and over a year and a half ago when we all used to fly had no idea which one was bankrupt, right? So in this case, it's like you don't know if this is a commuter airline or, you know, or JetBlue, right? Or is this, you know, Pan American and they're just going to go away in a year? And I think that sort of was a big lesson. Now, by the way, interesting note, Citron today, the biggest short, I don't know what you call them, because they're really, I think they're an investment bank without the banking piece. So they do analysis. They were a big force on shorting, and they have just announced they're going to move a bunch of their research, maybe all of it, out of shorting and into long. And I think this is fascinating because this is like somebody there, they suddenly understood a risk that they never understood before. And I think that that's probably, so there was some change that happened this week. Some people are going to lose some money for sure, and I feel bad about that. But I also think what happened this week, and it shouldn't have been stopped trading. Trading should have been sustained on all these platforms because actually that's the market working. And when you interfere with the market, as we did, you actually are, it's like you're messing with the experiment, and therefore the outcome is not going to be what you intend.
Hey, I want to stop real quick.
Let's bring up Dave.
Before we even bring Dave up, give me 1 sec. Melissa just mentioned that, you know, she got phone calls from like banks and or you know, reporters and all. What is Reddit? I wanted to give a little color commentary so everyone understands who's never heard of Reddit. I remember having a knockdown, drag out whiteboard fight with Alexis. Omid, can you pull up Alexis? Alexis is one of the co-founders of Reddit. He's 6'1". He's really big. And his brain is like insanely fast. And this is us whiteboarding together at South by Southwest in maybe 2010 or 12 or something with this crazy new thing called Reddit. And I remember getting my account on it and finding out about it. The real thing you need to understand about Reddit was actually it was really well structured in a fascinating way, very differently than all the other things because of what Melissa said, upvoting and downvoting and public moderation and all that. But maybe the more important thing is you have to understand is that this is not really the power behind all this. Alexis is just Serena Williams' husband. And you know, they understand how to play the futures, right? Serena's a pretty amazing tennis player. And maybe this is all just going back to having fun with games. But these are not shadowy people behind the scenes or something like that. These are people that's trying to figure out, you know, in that ethos early in the internet of like, how do we create a space that we don't have and how do we actually celebrate everybody? So, I just wanted to put a little color commentary on that in terms of what's really going on. I think we should get Dave in to get a sense of a little more background.
So
Dave,
up as this force between Wall Street and this new group of people tussling, and then we've had leverage in there that may be driving it, and then in the middle of the whole thing, a circuit breaker messes up the system. But Dave, you've been looking at this kind of from a network analysis and what nodes are heating up point of view. And so the narrative that we've been looking at, and this is a wonderful example of populist stuff, in this era of complexity, maybe things aren't as they seem. And tell me about your week.
Yeah, so, people in my network were watching this narrative as it unfolded. And, we tend to be kind of empirical and pragmatic about, kind of what we're paying attention to, and things that rapidly take attention, in the news cycle become objects of interest. And you're kind of going, okay, what is this? Is this organic? Is this not organic? What's the nature of it? Was it true? Is it not true? And what we saw with this was that immediately folks that we had been tracking for years as part of disinformation efforts and, things linked to, Russia and, other folks trying to inject disinformation into the U.S. bloodstream, they all started amplifying this really hard, really fast. So as an example, Steve Bannon, Jack Posobiec, Cassandra Fairbanks, Glenn Greenwald, Zero Hedge, Tucker Carlson, Matt Taibbi, Donald Trump Jr., Ted Cruz, Jordan Sather, and people with QAnon all started amplifying this stuff simultaneously. And we're kind of going, that's interesting. Why is this, network of folks very well known for disinformation suddenly amplifying this particular narrative? Now, as we've discussed this with the other guests, one thing that's really clear is that we've all latched onto narratives that define how we think about this, right? Like, that it's a really compelling narrative to say that, like, there's these, sort of evil, out of touch hedge fund guys, and that there's this band of, kind of very focused, people on Reddit who have gotten together to decide what they're going to do about, correcting the great wrongs of the financial universe. And they did this, and it caused them, the evil hedge fund managers to recoil in horror, and they lost billions, and they had to borrow billions to make it all balance out. And everybody's cheering the little guy, and it's like, Luke Skywalker going into the trench on the Death Star. Everybody's excited, and it's a very euphoric kind of moment, but that's also a very powerful narrative to employ for disinformation purposes. And, I think that what we were kind of trying to get at the bottom of is like, okay, who's amplifying this and why? What is the broader context of what's actually happening here? What should we be looking for in terms of, like, trying to determine the truth of this narrative and that kind of thing? And so, we started kind of digging in and looking at, what Steve Bannon was promoting. Well, Steve Bannon was saying that this was a populist uprising against Wall Street. All right. Well, Steve Bannon has for several years been trying to spark a collapse of the global economy and to, cause a turnover in global governments and to spark a nationalist revolution. So maybe he thinks that this is part of that, and he's trying to amplify that. Okay. Well, Steve Bannon also used to run a digital currency mining thing for World of Warcraft back in the late 90s with, the presidential candidate who was Brock Pierce in 2020, who's also deeply involved in cryptocurrency, and his campaign manager was Brittany Kaiser, who, was the fake whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica. And you start to kind of go, okay, let's back up here and kind of really get a sense of what is actually happening here. And, my feeling is that, this is definitely something that, is somewhat organic, that was sparked by, folks on Reddit who got together to drive these changes. However, there's also a lot of other involvement and people who are driving these narratives for the reasons that they have,
Is this a case of the phenomenon happens and then everybody tries to make that work for them, right? Like Ted Cruz made it work for him. AOC made it work for him. Obviously, Steve says it's lots of populism. And if you're Brock Pierce and those goes up as well, you're saying clearly there's value in alternative currencies because the dollar is ridiculous. So is it simply hopping on, or is it more like affecting it, like they're moving money into it, or they're actually driving the whole thing?
Well, I think there's potential for all of the above, and we don't really know what's happening because so much, communications happens encrypted, and we don't really know the degree to, for planning that may or may not have taken place. I don't think there's any value in speculating about, some grand design. I think the more you posit that there's some kind of grand plan to enact these kinds of things, the more I think you're on thin ice. But I do think that you can say that, like QAnon, these similar kinds of, movements where, they become emergent out of the soup of the internet, and people who are astute, people like, Bannon and whatnot, can see these things as they're coming out of the soup and go, hey, this is something we want to ride around on and get some mileage out of. And I think that that's kind of what we saw here with the, these disinformation actors and with people linked to Russia and that kind of thing. So, it's stuff that they're finding in the wild that's advantageous. And the thing that worries us in the disinformation community, we're looking at this going, okay, well, this particular instance isn't so harmful. Fine, if we wipe out a couple of hedge fund people,
but maybe this is a training exercise too,
but it's a training exercise, and what can we learn from this? And after 6 iterations of this, where do we end up? And what we found with, these kinds of disinfo programs is that they lead to radicalized communities, and radicalized communities are capable of doing all sorts of, nefarious things like we saw on January 6th. So what we're trying to do is kind of get ahead of saying, okay, this is a potentially radicalizable community. Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that, a narrative emerges around this, little guys versus big guys thing. And the little guys decide they're going to go on a serial binge of taking on a whole bunch of different targets in potentially creative different ways across the entire economy. And you get state actors involved in that. You get whales involved in that in various kinds. What are the effects of that over time? And then also, what kind of social capital constructs emerge out of that community as they bond and develop group identity out of that?
Affinity,
and that becomes cultish over time. And then what are the effects of that cult, and could that group be put to, similar kinds of ends like we saw in, on January 6th. So we're kind of thinking about this 10 steps out, where could this go? And so for right now, what would seem to me would be to make sense would be to shut down these kinds of exploitable holes in sort of the financial OS. So, to the extent that you mentioned, being able to short a stock to 137% or whatever, that's kind of silly and kind of doesn't pass the sniff
test. Some of Richard's suggestions, don't just put Band-Aids on, because that might be just encouraging the training exercise. Take the signals and see what the real system's doing, not what you hope it's doing, and fix it. I want to bring in something that you just made me think of. I'm more kind of naive about this stuff, so I'm trying to understand it. But, I remember learning about Rommel in World War II, and I remember that one of his kind of strategies was not to have a strategy. The strategy was to get within what's called the other side's OODA loop.
Right. Yeah.
And the OODA loop, if you could just get within the OODA loop, then you could do goofy things. And
I think that's exactly where we are.
He would just wait, and if something happened, he'd be like, "Okay, let's go." And I think we're at that point where it's so easy to start doing that kind of stuff. That, how does this relate to OODA loops? I guess I have a question for Dave or Richard.
Just to define it, it's observe, orient, decide, and act. So if you can get inside people's perception loops on this stuff, you can kind of disrupt their ability to kind of think.
Because they're about to act, and you just did a loop inside of it.
So you can basically get inside of, move faster than they're able to observe, orient, decide, and act. And that's actually the basis for what some people have called fourth generation warfare. There's a guy named William Lind who defined a lot of that, along with Paul Rayrick back in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's actually become kind of the foundational set of documents for a lot of what's going on the right in the United States, but also it's been applied to, similar kinds of approaches globally. And, we're not well equipped for that kind of stuff. It marries very nicely with kind of psychological warfare and psyops and all this stuff. But when you consider that, we are consumers of stories. We are audiences. We are manipulable. We are susceptible. One of the key tells with this for me was that, I saw these messages popping up on the right, and I use the right almost with quotes because some of these people are play acting at being on the right. And then I also saw, they're sort of fulfilling that role in society. And then I saw folks that are sort of on the ostensible left getting super excited about this because we're going to blow up the Death Star and all that. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. I want to blow up the Death Star too. But, you're seeing in this what you want to see in this to some extent. And there's a real tendency to do that. And once you start to kind of go down that path of like rooting for one team versus another, you lose the ability to think about this in a clear-headed way. And you become part of the audience that can be manipulated by that kind of OODA loop manipulation. So what I've tried to encourage is just a really cool-headed kind of like approach to this of like, we don't really know where this is going. This can be weaponized by bad people with bad intentions. Let's close the vulnerability. Like I think about it from like a cybersecurity standpoint. We've got an open port with some shit on it with a 0 day. We need to go fix that, and then we can like breathe for 10 seconds to figure out what the hell just happened. But, that's what we've got going on.
We're coming up at the top of the hour. I just want to make sure anyone, if you need to leave, we're an hour in. We're heading into overtime. And I'd love to get Hanu back in here, who we had introduced at the beginning. But wait, Peter, did you have something? And then Richard.
To pick up on what Dave was saying, one of the features of the kind of strident, not so much listening talk that we see, whether it was the talk on Parler or the left's cancel culture, or just what was being said on Wall Street, bets, is a certainty, right? It's a certainty that we're getting the man, that we're doing the right thing, as opposed to a curiosity about what's going on here. And that's kind of what you're saying, Dave, because if you're just certain, then you can go along with the tide could get you because it's a different agenda. And it kind of gets to science thinking versus not science thinking.
Well, I would characterize that in terms of social capital, and this is a long conversation we can have all about cults and how social groups work. But basically, what I've started to formulate is a sort of unifying theory of social capital, where if you have an inbred network of social capital that's tight enough, you can become convinced that you're right about just about anything, as long as all of you in that group believe that you're right. And you will start to not only make bets based on your own self-certain beliefs, you'll also start to dispense the existence of others who might disagree with you. And that's a very key feature of cults. And, the more that these radicalized networks become inbred from a social capital perspective, the more they'll behave that way. And, we need to kind of be aware of that and interrupt those processes, not so much by saying you're bad people, stop what you're doing, but make sure that those people's networks are connected in with other kinds of networks so that they have diversity of thought. If you look at groups of people, there's good papers you can find on this about people on Wall Street who have blown up. It's always these like tightly wound groups of like young men who are all high on their own supply and talking to each other, and they become convinced of certain hypotheses, and then they run it and it's successful, and then they get cockier, and then they do it again, and then they blow up. And what I'm trying to say with some of this Robinhood stuff is that if we allow that process to go at scale to completion, we will have a ton of people blowing themselves up using options, margins, and long trades in combination with each other. And we need to at least acknowledge that that's possible and maybe get ahead of it. So
let's bring on Hanu. You've been listening in for the discussion. Any reactions, any questions you want to ask Richard or Dave or Peter, or just sort of thoughts coming at it kind of cold? Oh, and make sure you're unmuted.
Right. So, like you, Mickey, I came into this kind of fresh. So this has been definitely an education for me as well. What I realized listening to Dave was that when we look at multifaceted phenomena like this, I'm already myself completely falling prey to imposing the narrative I want to see in this, which I think playing into my own interests is really this sort of pattern of democratizing tools that have previously been only accessible to centralized, well-funded institutions. Like essentially, you can see the Redditors here operating like a decentralized hedge fund, doing things that were previously only possible for large hedge funds. But that is just another narrative that happens to fit the way I see the world. So Dave, maybe to ask Dave and Richard. So the pattern you kind of mentioned, Dave, of people like Bannon spotting an emergent phenomena that they can use to ride this signal, like to essentially boost the signal of this phenomenon because it fits into their agenda. What are some other recent examples of that? I'm kind of fascinated by that idea, and it seems like certain people like Bannon are probably very good at this. It seems like a new form of almost like there are definitely some parallels to vaccines, etc., like amplifying the natural signal.
Well, I would say definitely the vaccine and the vaccine's hesitancy is one thing that they've latched onto, as well as the entire QAnon phenomenon, the idea that the government isn't telling you the whole truth and that there's people that can tell you the whole truth, and all of that has been amplified to great effect. It depends. I mean, at any given time, we're always sort of on the lookout for little fires to erupt around this. I mean, Epstein didn't kill himself. That's another one that people, you can basically weave any narrative you want around that and be right, things where there's a cult knowledge, or there's a perception that, there's a hidden truth that, isn't being shared with the general public, can be used to great effect. UFOs is another one. So that's one of the reasons why also this has become, like QAnon has become the great unifying field of all ever conspiracy theories, because it basically 9/11 truthing, it fits, JFK is alive, it goes in the bucket. Like anything you want, you can throw into that bucket, and it becomes part of the folklore and part of the, kind of compatible set of structures. So.
No, thank you. And I think the other thing that struck me, which was mentioned a few times in the conversation, which also fits the QAnon pattern quite well, is that this does feel like an alternate reality game. There is like an online game aspect to it. There was a great article by Adrian Hon, who is a designer of alternate reality games, on QAnon and how it operates exactly like an alternate reality game, where you have an online community that picks up on subtle hints and then follows them into various rabbit holes, puts together clues and so on, and does this kind of actually surprisingly powerful collective problem solving.
I do a lot of work with Jim Stewartson, who designed I Love Bees, and he talked with Adrian around his article, and it's a similar kind of thing where you do see these patterns about people finding the power of discovery, building community around solving puzzles and making patterns match, and it's like the pleasure you get when you solve a jigsaw puzzle, but doing it in the context of a community.
Yeah. Right. So I kind of personally find that to be quite a positive and powerful engine. Like it's in the case of QAnon, and it's obviously being used for quite strange purposes, and here we are seeing some significant financial impact. But it feels like the power of collective intelligence to actually solve fairly complex problems and pick up on these subtle cues could also be a very positive force in the world. So I do wonder whether what problem domains there are where we could channel that more positively.
You just reminded me of something, Hanu. I was at the Games for Change conference, which is a wonderful festival for play, but the serious study. So serious games and the serious study of how play might help us with dealing with racism, might help kids with cancer learning how to actually keep taking the medicine even if it disappears and things like that. And one of the presenters was the creator of Plague Inc. By Endemic. And the thing is that it's a massively multiplayer game where you play the plague. And then, and you're trying to work inside the OODA loops of the CDC and of the World Health Organization, all that. And it's a fascinating thing. And it was, the creator of it was like a person, But over time, he had to do all this study of the system model of how do we actually deal with plagues and how do we do this stuff? And it was a fascinating discussion because apparently millions of people play this game, probably not today, but I'd say 2 years ago. Very popular game. And it made me think of that would actually help. The thing that we see with play and with games is that it does allow you to actually try on a different persona. It does allow you to actually try a different identity and feel and have some resonance with it. And I just wonder, like, what are the positive tools? Maybe this is a question for Hannah. You might have seen this, or Dave, or Richard. What I don't see is the next generation of tools that just help us in whatever we want to call the newspaper or the front page of the future, like be able to like actually take into account human natural, cognitive shortcuts, biases by any other name and all that, and actually help us with the collective intelligence part of it. Help us with the swarm or collective intelligence part. Has anyone seen anything that gives them hope in this, so that we could almost get a system sense? The way people now, you can plug a thing on and have like an infrared sense or an ultraviolet sense with your phone or something. Could we have a system sense, like to understand when this is human foible and help us, or would it even work, or how would we be able to do this? Any thoughts?
I guess one could imagine technological solutions to which I don't think are sufficient here, but we could certainly imagine technological solutions of actually detecting cognitive biases that we can probably map associations between specific neural circuits and different types of human cognitive bias, and so you could have a bias warning system that sort of is triggered if something you've just posted feels like, okay, this is really just you reinforcing your own beliefs, whether directly from your brain or just from the tone of your tone of your message. But I think that's a really, really interesting question. How do we sort of create bigger structures that at a community level filter out some of those and enhance diversity? I did like Dave's suggestion of connecting disparate communities or figuring out ways to engineer those connections.
I'll ask you a question about how humans are programmed here, because imagine we had a cognitive filter that said you're just reinforcing an ever smaller inbred group, which is the point we made earlier. Well, like, I've done that. I've been on Parler and I've suggested to people they're reinforcing an inbred group. They don't really want to hear that. Tribes are generally not interested.
That doesn't work. Yeah.
You have to do better engineering than that.
Yeah, but the point is, we're because part of what you're discussing in general here is, if this conversation has been a warning about, and Dave, this is your point, when a group starts to swarm and then reinforces itself and only hears its own shit, that could get dangerous, and that could get dangerous whether it's kids on Wall Street or too many options with the guys on Wall Street bets. But that's like an instance of how we behave, and I guess what that brings up is we're programmed for that, and we program. How do you reinforce diversity? We know diversity works, but that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Well, here's what's funny, Peter, is I think that there's an interesting question, a fundamental question here. I have like a half-written blog on this for the last year, which is, I got in this argument with a friend of mine about history, and I said, I think the internet is both the most amazing experiment and a catastrophic tool for change. And what I mean by that catastrophic piece is this: for, let's call it 10,000 years, but it's probably like 5,000 years, human beings have had sort of limitations of recording technology and generational information transfer, which forced us to shared consensus backwards looking, right? That existed throughout time. Like, there were books that got burned, some that didn't, whatever, people forgot things. And so it wasn't that that's what happened, as we've learned, digging around for things like Troy and the Library of Alexandria, but it was that's how we remembered it. And at some point, we all kind of centered in on some sort of shared worldview. And what the internet did, and I don't think this was on purpose, John Perry Barlow, the late John Perry Barlow, and I got in an argument about this a few years ago, which is, I said, the internet is catastrophic for that sense of shared communal agreed history, because all copies of history still exist on the internet. So anything that was created since sort of like the mid 70s in terms of content, opinion, views, and also media, it still exists. Like, it didn't get forgotten, it didn't get burned, it didn't get lost. I mean, there's some breakage and loss at the fringes, but it's not nearly as complete as it was, or as quick. And so what happens is that modality of worldviews and past and well-worn sort of systems of thinking, they don't fall away. And so I can exist in a world where I believe that the Wall Street, the hedge funds on Wall Street are absolutely out to kill me. And at the same time, they could exist in a world where they're like, hey man, we're just trying to make money. I don't even know who you are, right? and we all have enough data recorded on the net to support that claim.
Well, but actually, I would probably disagree with this, but I actually think, I mean, there's a part that I would totally agree with. I like where you're going with this, but you know, there's a real problem with believing that information on the internet will survive more than about 15 years. There's a real problem with this, right?
Yeah, what's the half-life?
We should probably get Brewster Kale back on here, but the
I
idea
know, I was
is
just about to say we should get Brewster on here right away.
Yeah, the idea that there's a link that is in the best interest of a business to actually keep running on a server, pointing a URI pointing to a particular thing, right? It's not. We treat it like it's tangible, like this thing I'm holding, which unfortunately is empty. I've got to go get more. But you know, the thing is tangible, except when you ask the best computer scientists on the planet, the most important link in that new paper that Hanu wrote about synthetic biology and other kinds of things, that links to a most important thing. What's the chance that in 10 years I'll be able to click on that link?
But here's
and
the
actually
thing.
resolve it?
As
The
a
answer
guy who
is
used to run newspapers, the editorial process is as important as the archivist, right?
Of course,
so
but the problem
point
is
I'm
we don't
making
know
is
what
there's
our
no editor.
grandchildren.
Yeah,
But the problem is we don't know what our grandchildren will think is important for us, and consequently,
but Brewster, he's just saving everything. Forever. Yeah, but Brewster's saving everything that he can
not
save.
saving everything.
No, he's saving everything he can save. Like, you know, and he has some rules.
In a burning house.
And the new web world has completely broken a lot of the internet.
And it's
archives.
not intentional, right? Like, it's not yeah, like I support
we're doing the best we can, you know.
Yeah.
I love W.
Right?
Brian Arthur from the Santa Fe Institute, who wrote one of the seminal books on what the nature of technology is, possibly one of the most brilliant things I've ever read about actually thinking about what this black box is called technology. W. Brian Arthur ran hundreds of millions of experiments with agents to see what would happen if you had a new need and how these agents would evolve to solve it with technology. And of course, every time a technology was solved in this cartoon universe, it would create many more needs for the technology than it did for the actual user need that was identified. And he was able to identify that in all technology that we've seen, both organic and human-made technology, it is first a way of capturing some phenomena in the universe for purpose. Sunlight is falling on our planet, and we turn it into chlorophyll, and we do something. And second, a new technology has a lot of needs. It's very needy, maybe what Kevin Kelly might say, and things like that. But what he said is that, and what he found in these massive experiments, was that over time the technology structurally deepens from a seed, you know, a path dependency, and it fractally vascularizes, which is why cities are different than organizations and different than organisms. And he actually has some scaling laws that seem to actually prove themselves out, no matter what the city, the scale, the organism is, or whatever, because of this fractal vascularization. So the reality, though, is that means that 500 years ago or 50 years ago, we could talk about the Bauhaus in design, and it has way more power because it was the one that survived for us to talk about, because Herbert Bayer came over after World War II and helped with the Aspen Institute, and because Black Rock Mountain, and because the Institute of Design in Chicago was started by Mahali Naj, but because they survived, you know, World War II in Weimar Germany and made it over here, and the fractal vascularization, it's very hard to undo. You know, it's like the blind watchmaker for nature. So I'm not convinced that that all possible permutations of reality that would actually stand the test of science or anything like that exist, or that we could have our own future or our own flavor of it, or that we even know what really happened back in the day. All the things that died off.
I just want to come in. I think Dave, you need to take off.
Yeah, I need to run in a couple minutes. My wife is begging me that dinner is ready to go.
Yeah.
I want to bring up one, as you take off, Kathleen had a question, which I think is in your belly. Right?
Yeah.
Talking about the spiritual religious efforts here, but also science fiction and occult, how cults target emotional appeal of populists, right? So there's something going on here, which repeatedly, in multiple instances over the last few months, that relate to this.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been working for the last 18 months or so with a guy named Steve Hassan, who is like one of the leading experts on cults. I kind of came to this conclusion maybe the end of 2019 that I really felt like cults were kind of the key to understanding a lot of what was going on with this. And so I started looking at social capital in a general sense, like what is the nature of social capital, and is social capital maybe the hidden glue that makes our society and our culture function that we don't really look at because it's difficult to see. Like you can't see the connections between people when you just look at people, but it's there. It's a force that shapes how the world works. And so I started thinking about the idea of pathological social capital configurations, and that's basically what a cult is a pathological configuration of social capital. And I also was deeply influenced by the work of Liliana Mason, who wrote a book called Uncivil Agreement. And what she basically documented is as our American culture has become more and more homogenized and sorted by geography and things like that, we've become more inclined towards political violence. Some astonishing percentage of people believe that political violence is now justified for settling political disputes. And what she realized was that what sociologists previously, had identified as cross-cutting social ties, basically things that balance out our social connections where, we might not agree on politics, but we go to the same church, or we might, not agree on, what sports teams we root for, but we, shop at the same grocery store. All of those kinds of balancing social configurations that allow us to see the humanity in each other have been eroded by us sorting ourselves into, more increasingly homogenous pockets. And so I really believe that social capital is at the heart of all of this kind of cultish behavior. It's at the heart of the swarming behavior. The degree to which it's pathological is I think measurable mathematically almost. And that's something we need to get better at talking about. Steve did a PhD thesis this year at age 65 or so on a legal definition for pathological social capital, basically, that I think is super important. And to bring this all together and kind of have one final comment, I believe that what we need to start to focus on in terms of long-term strategy in the United States is social mixing and trying to figure out ways to do maybe national service that brings together people from different social milieus, whether it's, urban versus rural or, rich versus poor, black versus white, what have you, that we are basically cross-mixing ourselves constantly. And so that when people consider population-centered attacks, information attacks, and other kinds of manipulations on society, there will be a deterrent effect because people will realize that the country as a whole is too tightly wound and knit across all of these divisions that we just can't be exploited in that way. This is closing the 0 day in American society once and for all. And so I'm pushing that agenda hard. And what I found was that people that are very into national service realized that this was a really good angle to pursue, but they weren't in touch with the disinfo people. And the disinfo people hadn't yet arrived at the conclusion that this would be useful, a good solution. So while we're all talking about changes we can make to Facebook, this is kind of a 30-year plan, and we should do both. We should fix Facebook and have a 30-year plan. So anyway, that's my big idea that I'm trying to get injected into the Biden administration over the next couple months.
Dave,
That's cool. That's a good idea.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
Dave, the last time you were on, I think we ended up talking about Robert Putnam and his new book.
Yeah, Upswing.
And we're ending up there again, right? And
it's the same stuff at the end of the day.
Upswing. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you all. I'll see you next time. Great to be here.
you then.
If you can stick with us, I'd love you to kind of again put your technology and into kind of science fiction imagining thing. It strikes me that here's a conversation today that began talking about a manipulation of the financial markets and populism, but we quickly got to kind of the impact of the architecture of emerging communication technologies. All of this stuff that was supposed to create group intelligence and connection, well, it did create that, but then there was this feedback loop that reinforced, ever smaller communities, the stuff that Dave pointed out, which then can reinforce belief systems or cults or the fraying of things, which then pulls us away from facts a bit. And so the impact of technologies that were supposed to do one thing, we're clearly seeing something else. And now we're sitting around saying it ought to be different. Robert Putnam wrote a book, maybe it could be different. We're talking about mechanisms for that. You have the luxury of looking at imagining futures. As you put this together, how do you guide us to think about things, or what our scenario paths might be, kind of given this communications cul-de-sac that we appear to have worked ourselves in a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very excellent question. I think there's sort of definitely multiple paths forward. Picking up on one thing that Dave said, which was that one of the things that balances out extreme differences in opinion in kind of real meat space, real life, are shared community connections that are kind of outside the opinions. And those, of course, are pretty much entirely absent online. So we really kind of make that community interaction very one-dimensional. Like where do we fall on the political spectrum, or QAnon, or vaccines, or whatever, without any of those other balancing forces. So and I think this is all a function of the kind of rapid evolution of the internet, not really kind of vastly outpacing our design understanding of what it needs to be to facilitate meaningful human interaction. So I think there is I think if we kind of go into extreme directions, I think there is a future with some kind of more human internet, or more human communications infrastructure, where we lean into those emotional connections. We end up creating more robust, more diverse identities that are not just focused on whatever we happen to think about GameSpot or whatever the specific topic is, but where we are somehow also more broadly individuals that can interact multidimensionally on the web. And maybe that's actually, now that I think about it, I'm starting to imagine something more like Neil Stephenson's metaverse, or some of these more fully realized virtual worlds, which is actually a direction that has come back during the pandemic, as we have started to create alternatives to office spaces and so on. So that is one direction, some kind of more human internet that is more multidimensional. Obviously, the other possibility is the opposite, where we create an increasingly non-human internet, where it is increasingly filled with bots, where it's actually the bots and the artificial actors that obviously thrive in this environment vastly outnumber the human ones, and that's a weird one. And clearly, it's becoming easier and easier for us to create artificial agents that appear very human. So I'm kind of also imagining a future where there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 bots per every human user, and competing for their attention.
Is there anything we can actually learn from biology? In your deep dive into the democratization, the biohacker labs and things like that. And I was reading the Neo-Life book recently that Jane Metcalf pulled together. And you've got a small piece of science fiction in there, and someone else. And now I'm having a brain freeze. Someone had one about, so you're going to be designing your new child. Now you're going to want to think carefully if you want to give them the full Photo 4 package or the wings. But it's okay, because when they're 18, they can choose, and you really want to make sure that they have the ability to choose. In that sort of biological future, like if this were a biocentury, if it was as easy as we put up Reddit a few years ago, is it was as easy as being able to do sort of matter conversion, or being able to like have gene memes, that ripple through and things like that. What can we learn, or what might we see that maybe it's already happened in nature, we just didn't understand it, or at some lower level of or different level of what we see in life?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, also together with my co-founder Nikolai Eroshenko from George Church's lab, is that the direction that synthetic biology has been going is much less about trying to duplicate the conventional engineering principles, like electric. So the original idea of synthetic biology was like, let's do electrical engineering, but with biology. Let's have a well-defined
like
component.
Biocircuits or something.
Yeah, so circuits, oscillators, and things like that. And the problem is that the nature of biological systems is much more noisy and messy to typically allow those things to work. So the direction where things have been going, which feels more robust, is that let's actually look at nature as a source of solutions. So biological evolution has already created us solve pretty much every conceivable biological problem. So if we want to solve a problem, let's look to nature for solutions that we can repurpose and improve. And that is really pretty much the history of biotechnology. I mean, from monoclonal antibodies to CRISPR to PCR to pretty much every kind of biological tool we have. And so going more into understanding what is unique about biological systems and how do we actually make use of what they are good at. I think that's sort of been a useful direction to synthetic biology, and then that actually ties back to also some of the what's been interesting to observe in the community bio movement, which my good friend David Kong at Media Lab is one of the leaders of. That tends to tie into actually local communities and indigenous peoples who actually have access to a lot of biodiversity and who are looking for sort of local tools to solve local problems. So these are kind of maybe vague comments in the context of the present conversation, but I guess I kind of really would go back to thinking about what are natural biological systems that we can take inspiration from that involve a lot of interacting agents. Maybe that's the immune system actually, which tends to have heterogeneous. So some interesting things about the immune system. You have heterogeneous cell types that all have different feedback loops that respond to different things. You have I guess on the internet we already have like rapid amplification of some local thing. Like you only have to have the one B cell that responds to binds to viral antigen and then starts cloning itself exponentially. But there's also like suppressing backwards feedback loops. So Reddit down voting, but on a more global scale. So I think like we can look for but maybe like this is kind of the stereotype of Facebook where you have binary relationships with other people. You either are friends with them or not. And whereas like in biology things certainly are more, and in real life things are more multidimensional. So I guess more maybe we could apply the more now that we are no longer so dependent on what the bottom layer of the internet needs to be. We can build whatever we want on top of that. Maybe that top layer now should start to be more organic and biology like. Anyway, that's just some scattered.
Well, and you mentioned MIT and the community bio movement and things like that. I think what's fascinating, we had Megan Palmer on last week, who worked with Drew Endy really early on around the iGEM movement, and she showed a picture of just 10,000 high school and undergrad kids all doing synthetic bio like as competitions with high school kids. And like when I was a kid, it was like Tech Olympics, or it was the science fair, or it was whatever, or or there's one that's Odyssey of the Mind, it was called, and I think that's still around. But you've got a whole generation that, just as probably Alexis for Reddit, or me when I was a kid, learning how to use a Atari 400 or something, and write code and type in stuff from the back of Byte. People are starting to play with this biology stuff. Do you think there's going to be kind of like a natural appreciation for complexity, or the fact that these things are multidimensional and system things, just because nothing exactly works the way you think maybe in biology because it's such a rich thing? Do you think that'll actually help with societally? Because what I love about the iGEM movement is it's a global movement, and it's got this sort of a wonderful ethos and professionalism to it to build biobricks, open biobricks, and they've got like over 10 years worth of a database of wiki articles about the implications for policy and biosecurity that the students have to come up with. Like, think ahead. I don't know if you've been involved with the iGEM movement at all, but what's your thought about, like, if in fact bits and ones and zeros, so this very binary relationship we had because that was the way the internet worked, if this new internet of atoms and matter and the ability to move back and forth between bits and atoms and back again, rip COVID into the computer, share it with the world, learn about things, and then synthesize it and print it back out again, is that going to change? Is there hope in that way, I guess, for the next generation who kind of are almost natively learning about biology?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think that it could certainly lead to an entirely different way of thinking about the world. I kind of one thing that to tie back to some of the other threads outside biology, like one area that I think already have trained the up and coming generation to think more systemically and think more in terms of complex systems are computer games, which are an inherently systemic medium. You are like if you play Civilization or any kind of command and control type simulation based game, you are interfacing with a very complex system that you can only manipulate, not necessarily by like engineering it perfectly and controlling it perfectly, but by certain pokes and pushes and
the emergence.
This is a little bit of what we've seen going on with Wall Street Bets and stuff this week, which is a bunch of gamers coming together and intentionally playing that system like a game. Everybody do this, let's go do that. They've been looking for gaming strategies. I want to bring up something at the kind of the biological financial interface. We've talked about all of these kind of feedback systems we have, and John Maynard Keynes had a very smart quote about these feedback systems. And Omid, if we could put that up. Keynes pointed out that, and Omid, we have a slide right there. He pointed out that markets can remain irrational far longer than you can remain solvent, which is essentially
it's absolutely right.
Time frame of systems, right? So like we see these systems operating, and they're a system, and they're supposed to swing into equilibrium, but maybe not on your time frame. And that seems to be, that's, by the way, just to put an accent on that, and Richard, I know you can help us understand this. Yesterday, this entire mechanism, talk about one system sparking another, Dogecoin, which is absolutely nothing, because it was just a coin whose purpose was to point after nothing. And it for a long time had a market cap of $2 million because someone started it. And it did trade at 2/100,000ths of a cent. Except now it's in that between 2 and 4 cents, and it was between 17 and 20 billion yesterday. And so finally we have something that we know is nothing, so we can understand the premium between nothing and something, which is clearly more than a brand premium. We talked a bit about meme stocks. I was making fun of it, but there is something here where this is an expression of, just from a feedback and a normal financial point of view, this should make no sense at all. We're somehow financializing either outlier or populism or something. And I'd love to, as we finish up the show, understand that a little bit. I think this is not yesterday's bubble.
Well, it's interesting, right? So I have a couple of views. I have a couple of views about what the Dogecoin, and I actually do own a few Dogecoin. I should have probably sold them yesterday. I own them because, and this is why I was going to say, like, I think this is more like an NFT, right? So this is the interesting thing about cryptocurrency and the blockchain in general, is and actually I love what Hanu was just talking about, because the blurring of lines of what things are is one of my most fascinating things I'm thinking about these days, right? Like, Dogecoin to me is almost like a red badge of courage, if you will, right? It's like having it says you've been around long enough to be in on the joke, and you have some, and it is like having a little button that you can't get anymore. That's like a collector's item, or you can get it, but you're paying a lot more than the person that got it. I mean, what I paid for mine is nothing, basically, right? And the driving up of the price, I think, was less about a speculative financial thing and more about demonstrating. It was sort of like the roar of a gorilla after it like had defended its territory, right? So it's marketing, it's branding, it's badging. It is not financial, I don't think. That said, there's a fixed pool. It's not being mined anymore. So, you know, one could argue that Dogecoin is a discount Bitcoin, although I would really want to have that argument, and I think I would win, but it would be a harder argument than one would think, because it has some of the same attributes. And I think this idea of what is actually scarce and who decides what scarcity is comes back to the sort of fundamentals of financial markets and the fundamentals of society. And I think we are in a period of time where what is truth is questionable, and what is fixed and what is plentiful is questionable. And I think in some ways we all grew up with the belief that certain things were scarce when in fact they are not. And other things are not scarce when in fact they are. And I you know, John Perry Barlow, to mention him again, is like, he and I used to basically, the one thing we fundamentally agreed on is that time is the most valuable currency, right?
You know, we
and
also
so
talk about the fact that it is the artist, and from the artist's perspective, that we can understand, feel from ground, understand things. And I think we joked in the intro to this show that it was this whole thing going on with GameStop, an act of performance art executed in Robinhood. But I mean, you could look at this whole thing as a form of performance art whose purpose is to show us clearly what isn't working in the financial system, so we can have a serious conversation about hedge funds and extreme short squeezes to clean things up. I mean, that to me is the most valuable thing here. And then,
wait, so this is like Laurie Anderson. We were just dancing to Laurie Anderson all last night. This is like her performance art, but for this generation. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, look, when when you brought up NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which are essentially the expression of artworks as coins, and the minute you brought up NFTs, it's like, oh yeah, Dogecoin is like, it's like a work of art that's worth a lot now because that meme is in the art world. I guess I got to that because the art world is a place where that happens all the time. But the other thing, in addition to art being valuable, is it calls us on stuff. And understanding this week as performance art, to me, is as good as anything.
Well, Hanu, you just said something in the chat, and can you elaborate a little bit for people who have no idea what was going on in the Quantum Thief? Because there were so many ideas. So say a little more about that.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things that relating to both what Peter and Richard said on scarcity and art and finiteness of time. So one of the foundational ideas behind the Quantum Thief and the sequels is that in a future where essentially we have fully mature nanotechnology, pretty much every kind of material product you can imagine can be converted into information and trivially copied. So fully post-scarcity world. So what is scarce in a world like that? And the answer turns out to be quantum entanglement. So there's a very fundamental theorem in quantum mechanics called no cloning theorem, which means that if you have a quantum state, you cannot duplicate it without destroying the original. So a program on a quantum computer is actually a finite resource. And then the kind of most valuable quantum thing turns out to be, or the sort of hardest to duplicate classically thing turns out to be entanglement. So you can have, if you have two quantum objects and they interact, they remain connected, they remain entangled. And so in the quantum thief, you have these communities, which, by the way, have evolved from online gaming communities called the Zoku, who are defined by their shared entanglement. So if you belong to a Zoku and you kind of follow the Zoku's values and so on, you get more and more entanglement with the other members of the community. And that entanglement is then a resource that allows you to coordinate your actions with the other members of the community without communicating.
No matter where you are. Yeah.
No matter where you are, instantaneously. And there's a whole thread that we could go into about quantum game theory and how prisoner's dilemma can be solved with entanglement, but that's another story.
Read the book.
You have to read the book. But and in the quantum thief, there's also a society which is pretty much entirely a piece of performance art, where your time that you're allowed to spend in a human body is actually a currency. And when you run out of it, you get downloaded into a robot body and have to serve the community. But
you just wrapped it back to Richard. Time is a currency.
Finite time.
John Perry Barlow. Really nice.
Yeah.
I think. What time is it, Peter? Are we done yet? Is this? It seems like it's the evening. It's getting darker out.
Well, Mick, we can never.
Do we have a dead guest?
Yeah, we can't end the show. One of the things that we've learned is, in this world of entanglement, the past is always with us, and sometimes it creeps up on us more. So that's why we always have a dead guest on our show. And I'd like to introduce today's dead guest. It's actually R.C. Forbes. R.C. Forbes was a financial writer and analyst who worked on Wall Street in October and November of 1929. And since we've been discussing here what's valuable and what's not, I thought it'd be fun to go back to 1929. Now, the stock market has just crashed about 3 days in a row. Now we're into the following week, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And into that ferment comes R.C. Forbes and his advice. So let's take a look.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
The Wall Street panic, in my opinion, is over. It had to come. Stock speculation had become crazy. Like an appendix operation, it's a good thing to have it over with. I personally have been buying stocks since the crash set in on Tuesday. And I have been urging everybody else who can do so to buy without going into debt. Every time America has had a panic in the past, it has paid people to buy stocks in the midst of the excitement. I am absolutely confident stocks purchased during this panic, and we've had a panic, make no mistake about that, will also yield very generous profits. Now is the time to buy. I hope you have plenty of all to wade in and buy.
I think he made it through a wormhole onto Wall Street Bets, which is what we were seeing last night. Mick, I think you're muted, but you don't want to be.
I don't know. Maybe I should be. Thank you. What was his name? I didn't see his title. He should have typed in
R.C. Forbes. His title was R.C. Forbes, Redditor.
I seriously am changing my Redditor account tonight.
Well, thank you, R.C.
We should keep his picture up there. That's great.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, including R.C. Forbes, who didn't have a great roaring 30s, I think, after the 20s. But let's hope the roaring 20s teach us something.
Let's end up on a prediction. I'd love to hear from everybody where GameStop will be in 6 months.
That's a really interesting question.
I have no idea how to answer that question.
I think it started at $5. I'm going to say 10. I think there'll be some residual value accretion, which I think is a good thing, but it's definitely not going to be at 300.
I mean, right. And Hanu, any thoughts? Yeah.
Not super well placed to make predictions, but I wonder if it'll be the new Dogecoin coin, whether it'll become like a status to drive up the value. So maybe I'll say like 50.
All right. Peter, what about you?
Well, look, I have not announced this yet, but it's clearly that conspiracy mechanisms are what drive this thing. And soon I will announce that I'm running to be the new Q. and we may learn something about where this fits in my platform, but I've not yet announced that I'm of that campaign. Although I will say that people who actually look at the fundamentals say it should probably end up somewhere between 10 and 12 if the new CEO does a cool thing and makes a real company. But
see, I thought you were going to have Marshall McLuhan back on, but I guess he's been on too often to teach us a little bit about the medium, the message, and the currency.
Well, actually, we should point out that we had Andrew McLuhan, his grandson, on a couple of times. We did a deep dive on McLuhan, and we have an upcoming show where we're going to have L.M. Sakassis, who writes for the New Atlantis, and wrote a very smart piece called The Analog City and the Digital City, which is essentially looking at these two cultures, along with Andrew McLuhan, and we're going to dig into that. If there's one thing this conversation set the table for, it is the culture of technology that's driving so much of stuff. So we never get far from McLuhan around here.
Hey, wait, our other producer, Mohib, who tuned in today, is saying we should just have a Quarantine coin. And here I've been trying to get rid of that brand for about a year. Well, thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much, Hanu. Thank you, Omid and Mohib and everyone who's helped us pull this together this week. Please have a wonderful weekend.
And now we can tell you it's 5:51 Pacific Quarantine. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine.